Well, hey there, it's that coding guy here, breaking it down and making it accessible. In this video, we're going to talk about inversion of control, dependency injection, and the @auto-wired annotation. So if you've got questions on these topics, you're in the right spot. Let's get started. I'm going to be using the Dungeon Keeper application that we've got going on, and I'll put a link to that repository on GitHub in the description. So we've got this SpringBoot API, and I'm looking at the controller right now, and it's got a dependency on the room service. So for our layered architecture, really the controller should call the service, and the service calls the repository. So because the room controller is going to call the room service, we need a valid room service so that we can use methods from that service, right? So the way that we do that here in Spring Boot and in Spring, we utilize auto-wired. So this is dependency injection. So when the server is starting up, it sees that we've got a room controller here, and part of its processes are like the constructor is going to run, and in order to create a valid room controller, it needs a valid room service. Like that's part of what this requires. So the framework then is going to be like, well, room service. Do I know anything about room service? And if we come into the impl here, like, aha, we've got the @service annotation here, and it also has a dependency. So we're starting to journey down this dependency tree, right? And so I'm thinking as the framework here, I'm like, all right, room repository. This room service impl has a dependency on that. So in order to be a valid room service impl, I need a valid room repository. Well, do I know anything about a room repository? I do. It's annotated @repository. This is an interface. It's extending this CRUD repository. And lo and behold, this has no further dependencies that are declared here. So we've kind of reached the end of the dependency tree for this room domain. So at that point, it kind of like rewinds, right? So, okay, now I can go ahead and instantiate this room repository. Well, that means that, in the room service impl, I now have a valid room repository. I can inject that into this room service impl, right? And that's what the auto wiring here is doing. So, and now that we've got the valid room repository injected into the valid room service impl, we go back up to the other layer in the room controller, and now we've got a valid room service that we can inject into the room controller, and now we're set and ready to go. And if at any point we had come across something that wasn't annotated correctly, like let's just start this up real quick, and I'll show you what I'm talking about. So just to prove that, you know, this is valid right now, my service started up with no problems. It's running now. I'll just stop it real quick, and what I'll do is I'll take the @service annotation off of this room service impl. Now, even though this exists, the framework isn't going to know about it because we took off the thing that lets Spring know that it exists. So what I'll do is I'll try to start this server up again. And what we're going to get is an exception here because it says, and you know, these exceptions can be hard to parse as a human. Like, what is this trying to tell me? And over the years, they have gotten better. Some of them are still a little esoteric, but this one is saying, hey, room controller required a bean or a component of type, and if we scroll over, we say, all the way down the package chain to room service that could not be found. So it started going down that dependency management tree, and it found something that it could not fulfill. And so it did not start the server. And that's great, because that protects our service from starting up with a configuration that is not valid, where we don't know necessarily what the results of having that service be up and running would be. So this is great. This is protecting us. So now if I just put that at service back in, that'll start up correctly again. And we would get that same kind of error if we forgot to annotate these repositories or the controller. If we left off REST controller or something here, then we would get a similar exception, I'm sure. So what's the value of this, right? Like, why do we do this? What is this? So one of the things that makes dependency injection so powerful is that we can choose what to supply this with whenever we create a new room service impl. We can supply whatever we want Spring to inject. And so if I was in a unit test and I wanted to have a mock implementation of my repository, I can create a mock implementation of that repository and pass it into the constructor for the room service impl, and then we automatically can have that injected into our service. So now, instead of using an actual repository, I'm using a mock implementation, and that makes things a lot easier to unit test. And this also kind of decouples things so that we can provide these different injections of different dependencies whenever we want to. And it keeps it more agile and easier to deal with. So at the end of the day, that's really the basics of dependency injection. And there are other dependency injection frameworks out there as well. It's not just Java and Spring Boot that do that. So that's a bit about dependency injection there. And then we said inversion of control. Oh, and that also kind of took care of auto-wired. So basically, because this is annotated with that service, and if we look in here and control click, we can see that this has a list of other annotations. This is kind of an alias. So, and the main one here that I want to point out is component. Now, this is at service. If we look at room controller and we look at REST controller, which is actually a controller, we get the same list of stuff, right? We've got target, retention, documented, and component. And similarly, if we look at the repository and go to @repository, we get the same stuff, right? It's target, retention, documented, and component. So what these are is all semantic sugar for us. These are all the same thing. They're just named differently for us as developers, so that when we rock into a file and we see controller, or in this case REST controller, we're like, aha, this file is for defining endpoints and calling services. And when we rock into some sort of file and we see that it's documented as an @service, well, that's a clue to us that means, you know what, this file is probably going to deal with business logic and validation and things like that, or processing. And when we look at a repository and it's documented and annotated as an @repository, that's a clue to us and other developers that this file and its operations are going to deal with the data layer and database access. So it's really just convention for us on these annotations. And not only that, it's the at component here that is really delegating and saying, hey, framework, hey, Spring, this is a component that I need you to know about, and I need you to manage it for me. And so that when I need access to it, I'll auto wire it in where I want, and then you can give it to me. And what this does is this is the inversion of control, right? Where most of the time we're delegating all of the workings of our service up to Spring, and it's managing everything for us. And the only time that our business logic takes over is when something interesting happens, which is generally us receiving a request to one of our controller endpoints. And then our business logic takes over. But for the most part, all of the stuff is delegated up to Spring. It's that inversion of control. We're letting Spring handle it, and then that frees us up from having to worry about all of the low-level things that the framework is taking care of for us. And we get to focus as application developers on business logic, validation, and all the things that we need to code to solve our particular business problems. So that's a bit about auto-wired there and inversion of control. And we talked about dependency injection first. All of these concepts are kind of intertwined and interrelated. And I definitely had a problem understanding auto wiring at first as well. And I would get null pointer exceptions and things like that because I had forgot to set an auto wire on a component, or I had forgotten to annotate things correctly. So just know that if you're creating a component or some sort of bean that you want Spring to manage, then you've got to annotate it with something. And at component will get the job done, but using controller or service or repository to more surgically define the purpose of that component will go a long way to helping you and other developers. So I think that's about all I wanted to talk about there. If you've got any questions, throw them in the comments. And if this video was helpful to you, throw me a like and a thumbs up there. Subscribe to the channel. It really helps the channel when you guys interact with the videos. And I would love to hear all of your questions and comments on this content. So thanks for watching. Cheers.